Welcome back everyone for a monumental Miyagi Cobra Kai Season 6 Watch Party! Mr. Miyagi is coming back. No, not literally. The number of comments from you guys telling me that Pat Morita has died is insane. You don't have to keep telling me. That doesn't stop Mr. Miyagi's presence from being felt though. From the beginning, Ralph Macchio and the show's creators have made it a point to include the legacy of Mr. Miyagi and especially how his connection influenced Daniel even into his adult life. Every season there has been flashbacks to his teachings as well as further glimpses into his life that Daniel didn't previously know. Last season's trip into his room with a little story from Amanda has opened the door to even more secrets to come. The trailer featured the biggest tease we've had in a long time, a case hidden away beneath the floorboards, filled with something from Mr. Miyagi's past. Could it be bell-bottom pants from the 70s? A history of his time as a janitor at a cafe back in the 1950s? Or maybe the box office receipts from the last movie? No, obviously not. Luckily, Netflix essentially gave us the answer, at least partially. They released this image, which is clearly a peek at what is inside the case. Now we should keep in mind promos aren't the full show. This may not include everything, or maybe some things are slightly different than how they'll be, but it is definitely a starting point. But what we have is a collection of all sorts of plot points. I think that is the best way to describe them. If Miyagi kept them all, it must have had some sort of value, even if he buried it under the floorboard. Now very briefly, I don't think there's a whole lot of value in overanalyzing any individual piece in the picture. Definitely the headband and gi are interesting. We have two dates, May of '38 and a calendar from 1959. It looks like it could be either from September or December. However, common sense, a rarity in this fandom, tells us that the month is obviously December. There's an old passport, letters, and all sorts of other things. Like I said, this really isn't much and there's not a whole lot we can learn from these directly. Instead, we can learn a lot from the interviews. In those interviews, Ralph has talked extensively of Daniel learning more about Mr. Miyagi and having his image of him shaken or even shattered. See what he says.
And then this season is a deep dive where Daniel discovers certain things about Miyagi that may not be as flattering and may lead him down a kind of darker path of misunderstanding or understanding. With the concept of finding information, finding these clues to a past that don't line up with the perfect mentor that Daniel has always carried Miyagi in.
Okay, since Mr. Miyagi is sort of a legend and hero in Daniel's eyes, when Ralph talks about his view being shaken, then clearly what he is learning are some negative things about it. Ralph refers to a sort of a hunt. Basically what I gather is Daniel looks through the items in the chest and tries to backwards investigate them. Each time it leads to an unsavory detail about Mr. Miyagi he previously didn't know. So first off, I suspect Daniel's likely going to proceed in chronological order, at least as best he can. It would be the most reasonable. That also means one of the first ones would be this one from 1938. Now this appears to be an identification card from UCLA. It also mentions borrowing a book, so I don't know if it was also a library card or doubled as one, but it's something around that. The important thing now is it's from 1938. So if we line it up with Miyagi, that would be when he was 13 years old. What the fuck? Okay, something's going on here. Mr. Miyagi couldn't have been in the US, much less at UCLA for whatever he was doing at 13 years old. And yes, maybe the ID card belonged to someone else, but Miyagi had to be there at that time or around that time in order to obtain this somehow. So the point stays the same. So this has to be our first major clue. The timeline is wrong. This actually isn't surprising. I've discussed this with Peter and Brianna from Cobra Kai Companion. It was always a little sketch based on his birth date on the gravestone. You recall at the outset of World War II and after Pearl Harbor, the US government shut down immigration to the United States. it would have been nearly impossible for Mr. Miyagi at 16 or 17 to sneak into the country and then subsequently enlist in the 442nd. Did he come at 14 years old or so? I think that is what we were going with, but darn, that was young. Here's the thing, this tombstone was a bit of a mistake. I think it was Josh who made these dates and they realized they messed up. They wanted Miyagi to live later than Pat Morita did, so he would have known Samantha and seen Anthony. They were focused on the day he died, and then just went backwards for the day he was born and forgot to take into consideration his fleeing to America just before the start of World War II. I'm guessing now they are using that previous mistake as a plot point. Mr. Miyagi was probably older than he let on. Hard to say for sure, but I'm going to say maybe 5 or 6 years. That way he was born in 19 or 20 and came to America around 37 or 38, which ultimately got him to UCLA for whatever the heck he got this for. So now the question is, why did Mr. Miyagi lie about his age and when he was born? Daniel would be shocked, right? Like that is something he never imagined Mr. Miyagi would do. Why would Mr. Miyagi lie to him about that? Strap in, I have a theory and it's gonna be a doozy. While editing Peter's Miyagi character essay, More Than Miyagi, which focused heavily on his time in the 442nd, I came upon a factoid which is somewhat lost to history. In real life, the 442nd was only open to Asian or Japanese Americans who were natural-born citizens. That is important. A naturalized citizen, or especially a recent immigrant like Mr. Miyagi, would have never been allowed into the unit. Now in real life, I think Robert Mark Kamen and John Avildsen were unaware of that detail when writing the original movie. It was a time before internet research. I always just assumed we continued to look over that detail. It didn't really matter. In this universe, where time and ages mean nothing anyway, Miyagi was able to serve. Except, what if they decided to do something with that detail? Perhaps Mr. Miyagi borrowed or even stole someone else's identity to enlist. That person was born on June 9th, 1925. That person was a natural-born US citizen and thus able to enlist in the 442nd. Since he was using that on his official forms, he just sort of adopted it as his new birthday. It was off by 5 or 6 years, but no one really noticed, and he never told Daniel. Besides, man, Asians are hard to tell how old they are. Now, there could be a little bit more to this old-fashioned identity theft. What about the guy he was stealing it from? He would have been a young kid or so, sometime between 1938 and 1943. Maybe there was a fight or perhaps even an auto accident, and the young man died. Perhaps that young man was around 15 or 16, the same age as Daniel LaRusso in the movie. Was Miyagi's birthday present of a car a way of making amends for that fateful encounter many years ago? It always did seem like an extreme sort of birthday gift. Maybe it was all a little more about Miyagi than Daniel. It's not a surprise that while reflecting on it, he gave his fateful advice.
You remember lesson about the balance. A lesson not just karate only. Lesson for whole life. Whole life have a balance.
Ah, timeless and beautiful. But that's not the lesson I'm referring to. I meant this one.
Just remember, license never replace eye, ear, and brain.
Oh, eye, ear, brain? He's telling him to drive safe. Perhaps reckless driving was on his mind this night because of something from his own past? Perhaps Miyagi was thinking of his own life as well as Daniel's. Either way, he never told Daniel. These are things Miyagi would feel deep shame over, and he can understand why, so many years later, he never wanted to bring it up. Besides, Miyagi was a very personal man. It's partially culture, he just didn't share these things with people. Now, let's go a little further. We know Daniel finds many truths about Miyagi that changes his image of his sensei. Now we suspect Miyagi took someone else's identity in order to enlist in World War II. We don't quite know when Miyagi married his wife or the reasons around that. He does say he first saw her in Hawaii when immigrating, we presume. That would still be at least around 1938 or so. He thought she was beautiful, but then he also thought Yukie was beautiful. So much he loved her until the end. This dichotomy has never really been addressed. Maybe Miyagi held off pursuing anything serious with her because of his loyalty to Yukie. That's what she did. She never got married. But obviously, he did get married, or at least he claims he married her. You know, we never see a wedding photo of the two, which isn't the biggest tell, but since he has 2 pictures of her, it seems odd they never took a wedding picture. Is it perhaps they were never officially married? Maybe he said he'd marry her when he got back from the war, but never got the chance. Now, presumably the army thought they were married, so maybe I'm reading too much into that. She died on November 2nd, which makes the timeline a little difficult. We don't know precisely when Miyagi joined the 442nd and deployed. There's something else involved with all this that I'm speculating, as I'm not sure how it all lines up. For a long time, I thought young Mr. Miyagi may have been sort of like Johnny, a guy who drank too much and was a little quick at the draw, got into fights. When we saw him in the movie, he had changed and grown a lot. He was far more balanced. But that didn't stop Miyagi from getting drunk on a bad day, sort of the way Johnny gets drunk when life crushes him down. So Miyagi was a guy who was hung up on his old love, Yukie, just like the way Johnny was hung up on Allie.
I don't think I ever really got over her. I mean, I dated plenty of babes after, but I never really let my guard down with any of them, you know? Not like with Allie.
Maybe he viewed this pretty girl he met in Hawaii as a babe he could hook up with, but she was never going to replace Yukie. But then this woman got pregnant, sort of like the way Shannon did, and Carmen for that matter. Now remember how Johnny couldn't handle the thought of being a dad? He checked out on day 1. Maybe Miyagi did the same. This woman wasn't Yukie. She wasn't the one he wanted to have kids with. He checked out, or in this case, went off to the 442nd to Europe. He was trying to get away from them. Maybe he even wanted to get himself killed in the fighting. Ultimately, she died and the baby died. He felt grief from that forever after. He blew his chance. He wasn't there for him. He doubled down in anger and ended up winning the Medal of Honor. But even when he came back to America, he had realized what he had done. I may be stretching the Miyagi-Johnny Lawrence connection a bit thin. I do think these are all revelations that Daniel would find disturbing, but that ultimately don't ruin Miyagi's image or legacy. After all, these are the same things Johnny has done right here in the show, and he's already a favorite character, and he's Daniel's friend who's making right with the world. So we wouldn't dislike Miyagi for any of this. Luckily, we know Daniel's quest will run almost the whole season.
It's an exciting and thought-provoking narrative for what is almost 13 episodes of the entire season 6.
So I would say it begins in episode 3, which Ralph directed, and will conclude in episode 15, the series finale. And as you remember, the first episode of the show was called Ace Degenerate. That was based off this.
Honey, who you kidding? You're still the ace degenerate.
No, ex-degenerate, man. 8 a.m. tomorrow, I'm a senior. I've got 1 year to make it all work. And that's what I'm gonna do, make it work. All of it, right?
So you see, Johnny was trying to be an ex-degenerate, but he fell back into the role of ace degenerate. Drunk driving and the like. You wonder if Miyagi did stuff like that? But he's grown and not like that anymore. In fact, we know from a trusted source, the final episode of the series is called Ex-Degenerate. The initial assumption is to just assume it's referring to Johnny. It's a fitting bookend, but I no longer think so. Daniel's journey goes 13 episodes, from episode 3 to episode 15. He's going in chronological order, as I already theorized. That would mean it would take him some time to shortly before the first movie, when Mr. Miyagi had left the degenerate side behind and found his balance. That is, I believe episode 15, Ex-Degenerate, refers not to Johnny Lawrence, but instead to Mr. Miyagi. It sort of makes sense. While the show began with Johnny, it's grown to feature both him and Daniel, as well as the rest of the cast. Having the last episode reference him or any one person just wouldn't fit with the ensemble feel the show has now. If the final episode were to reference just one person, then the only person that could be is Mr. Miyagi, hence Ex-Degenerate, and hence Daniel's 13-episode quest to discover that truth. Daniel's conclusion to season 6 is realizing the path Mr. Miyagi had gone on. Johnny's conclusion to season 6 is having completed that same path Mr. Miyagi went on. What do you think the secret to Miyagi's past will bring? I want to hear what you have to say. Make sure you subscribe because I'm going to be covering everything. Have a great day. I'll see you at the next watch party.